For what justice is there in this, that a nobleman, a goldsmith, a banker, or any other man that either does nothing at all, or at best is employed in things that are of no use to the public, should live in great luxury and splendour upon what is so ill acquired, and a mean man, a carter, a smith, or a ploughman, that works even harder than the beasts themselves, and is employed in labours so necessary that no commonwealth can hold out a year without them, can earn only so poor a livelihood, and must lead so miserable a life, that the condition of the beasts is much better than theirs. Let's talk about Utopia. Thomasmore's Utopia is a fascinating and revolutionary novel written in 1516, which explored the experiences of a narrator describing a society they'd discovered in a faraway land, which held some fairly progressive views on equality, justice and democracy that seemed to contrast with More's lived experience. The period during which this book was written is one that most people who are educated in the British education system will recognise as being the Tudor period. And more specifically, this was during the reign of history's favourite giant man-baby, King Henry VIII. Now, Utopia is largely recognised as a satirical swipe at 16th century contemporary society, providing a vision of a different way of doing things, and to provide a juxtaposition to what was considered normal in the public mind. Now, there is a lot we could talk about with regards to the specifics of the book, and to some of the ideas on equality, democracy and economics discussed therein. But for today, I mostly wanted to discuss the way that Utopia itself became a way of creating an alternative to what was considered the common sense of traditional society, to expand political conversations and to shift the Overton window of what is possible. And that is why we're going to talk about it.
Nobody owns anything, but everyone is rich. For what greater wealth can there be than cheerfulness, peace of mind and freedom from anxiety?
Utopia, in the book at least, was a specific place, an island nation with its own culture, structure and standards, where they valued openness and democracy and slavery. But let's step back from the specifics of the book and look at the word itself. Thomasmore coined the term Utopia himself, so let's take a look at both the modern definition and its origin, starting with the modern, which says, an imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect. Imagined and perfect signal to us immediately that the modern idea of utopia is not something that is conceivably achievable. It is instead a theoretical or conceptual construct, and this is important to understand, as you will see as we progress through this video. When we scroll down a bit further on the definition on Google, the Oxford Dictionary version, it gives us the Greek construction of the term, which is what Thomasmore used to create the word. He combined ou, which means not, and topos, which means place, to make utopia, or not a place. Now, Thomasmore was making a deliberate pun on the fact that this city could not exist as both a signifier of its alien cultures and philosophies, and to make the point that such a city could not exist in the world as it stands. One might even conclude that things would have to change for utopia to become a conceivable and realistic prospect. Fascinating. But why are you telling me all this? Are you some sort of historian or literary expert? No. But I do like this idea of having a utopian vision. And in fact, I would go further and argue that being able to conceive of a utopian vision of your own is a vital tool for left-wing politics. Now come with me as I sift my way through a number of loosely connected thought piles that I find interesting, and hopefully you will too.
Consider any year that many thousands have died of hunger, and yet if a survey was made of the granaries of all the rich men, it would be found that there was enough among them to have prevented all that consumption.
In these times of doom and gloom, impending disaster, and a seemingly terminal decline in British politics, culture and economics, it's important to have something that you can envision as a potentially positive outcome. Even in our darkest moments, we have to be able to imagine a better future. Otherwise, we simply commit ourselves to apathy, or worse still, becoming doom-pilled. Now, in case you aren't aware, doom-pilling is basically when you become so bummed out from the amount of current and impending dooms that you just accept it as inevitable. Now, I realise that this can probably describe the majority of life as a leftist in the UK or US, but at least we have a word for it now. Frankly, we can't afford to be doom-pilled, because too many lives depend on us finding an improved situation. To become apathetic and nihilistic is an indulgent privilege that should be left to angry incels and the "have I got news for you" Twitter. Tempting though it is, we must resist the urge to curl up into a ball and surrender to the UK politics abyss. That way lies monsters. Now, solar punk is an interesting example that uses the power of a utopian vision to create a positive, optimistic and proactive movement. To take the definition from Wikipedia, because I'm lazy, solar punk is a literary and artistic movement that envisions and works towards actualizing a sustainable future interconnected with nature and community. The solar represents solar energy as a renewable energy source and an optimistic vision of the future that rejects climate doomerism, see doom pills. While the punk refers to the countercultural, post-capitalist and decolonial enthusiasm for creating such a future. Its imagery and outlook is colourful and hopeful, whilst also acknowledging the pending challenges of a world affected by climate change, signposting ways that we can envision preferable end states, even as we accept the limitations of our resources and environment. Andrewism on YouTube has done some really insightful videos on this, so I suggest you go check those out once you're done here. It can be a real tonic in the bleakness of current times. And ultimately, whilst remaining honest about the challenges we face, we have to balance the need for clear-sighted analysis of the world around us with the very human need to believe that something can be done, that humanity can transcend its current state, and that out of the wreckage of this world, the potential for a better way of living might be realised.
Therefore, I must say that as I hope for mercy, I can have no other notion of all the other governments that I see or know than that they are a conspiracy of the rich, who on pretence of managing the public only pursue their private ends and devise all the ways and arts they can find out.
Life in the 21st century is awash with information, media and distraction. There are 1,000 good courses, all of which require your attention. There are 100 stories each day about ghoulish politicians with horrendous views and smooth brains, and there are a million different ways that we can choose to escape the banal horrors of daily life to protect our mental health. It is not hard to lose your bearings or to become fixated on the latest main character on Twitter. See SK the Crusader's excellent video for more on that. Or to focus all your energy on a particular issue, or even to lose yourself into doom-pilling, which is something I've done myself. By using a utopian vision as a landmark, you can ensure that no matter how deep in the woods you end up, you can still ensure you're travelling in the right direction. How does the way you currently expend your energy help to get you to that vision? How does this campaign, that candidate or this policy take you a step closer to the world you dream of? And if you find on reflection that the subject in question doesn't get you closer to that utopia, then you can evaluate whether it can be changed to be more useful, whether it has another purpose that is valid for you personally, or whether it should be dropped and a more productive focus selected instead. Utopia can be the lens through which our political, social and cultural activities are viewed to ensure we aren't allowing ourselves to be sidetracked into comforting cul-de-sacs or having our energy seeped away to serve someone else's intent.
The utopians fail to understand why anyone should be so fascinated by the dull gleam of a tiny bit of stone when he has all the stars in the sky to look at.
The original purpose of the City of Utopia was to provide a visible counter-argument to the way that society had been developing in the European West. More wanted to show a reflection that people could imagine that would make them question things that they would normally take for granted, such as the idea of brutal punishment for criminals maybe not being the best way to reduce crime, or the lack of utility of gold and other materials when weighed against the value of human life. By showing people a fantastical vision of an impossible city, More is causing people to consider why it's considered impossible. In the 21st century, we wrestle with a similar lack of political imagination, with many mainstream pundits, politicians and intellectuals heavily invested in Francis Fukuyama's end of history, the idea that we have peaked in terms of the forms of government, and that a free market liberal democracy cannot be improved upon. The difficulty introducing new political ideas to this landscape was exemplified by the demonisation of Jeremy Corbyn's gentle social democratic platform of 2017 and 2019, as the established power structures fought back against any threat or any change to its comfortable position. The irony, of course, is that even Fukuyama himself has admitted that 25 years ago I didn't have a sense or a theory about how democracies can go backward, and I think now they clearly can. Anyway, my point is that we need a utopia as badly now as we ever had, to remind people that things don't have to be the way they are. There are different ways of doing things, and perhaps most importantly of all, that there are better ways of treating each other, if we're brave enough to try.
Nor can they understand why a totally useless substance like gold should now, all over the world, be considered far more important than human beings, who gave it such value as it has purely for their own convenience.
All conscious actors in politics have an ideology of some sort, that shapes their view of how the world should be and how society should function. In this way, ideology is similar to utopia, though the definition has some important differences. Going back to Google and its Collins English Dictionary definitions, we have the modern definition and two archaic definitions. The modern says, a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. And the two archaics are the science of ideas, the study of their origin and nature, and visionary speculation, especially of an unrealistic or idealistic nature. So, the wording in the modern definition certainly comes from a more scientific place altogether, talking of systems, theory and policy, as opposed to the more evocative tones of utopia, where the definition spoke of imagined perfect and, of course, not a place. The archaic part is interesting though. The first part talks of the science of ideas, the study of their origin and nature, and then it has this juxtapositioned visionary speculation, especially of an unrealistic or idealistic nature. The first archaic definition feels like the modern usage of the word, with its focus on technocracy, models and policies. The second archaic definition, however, feels more like our understanding of utopia, with its emphasis on an almost whimsical nature, unrealistic or idealistic even. Also tellingly, we seem to have moved from ideology once being considered an idealised endpoint to something much more grounded in the present tense and in a more measurable reality. At some point, when moving from one understanding to another, ideology became less about describing an end and more about the means of travel. If a modern understanding of ideology is indeed a system of ideas and policies, to what end does this system exist if we are not able to describe the outcomes of such a system? In this way, I find it helpful to think of utopia and utopian visions as being the desired end state, and ideology as the sort of path chosen to get there, at least in terms of the modern definition of the word. If you talk to an anarchist and a communist about what their perfect society would be like, their end goal, it is quite likely that both might say egalitarian, that all people are equal, deserve equal rights and opportunities, fair distribution of resources and some form of post-capitalism. But both would also likely envision a very different set of policies and actions to get there. In this way, their utopian visions may be very similar, but the paths and ideologies they use to get to those end goals may be very different.
There are dreadful punishments enacted against thieves, but it were much better to make such good provisions by which every man might be put in a method of how to live, and so be preserved from the fatal necessity of stealing and of dying for it.
So what happens if you have a political party or movement without a utopian vision? Well, whilst it is true that the Conservatives in the UK have their divisive issues, their end goal seems to be largely still shared. But when we look at the Labour Party's base, there does seem to be a more fundamental difference in opinion as to what the end goal should be. Though it can be safely surmised that for most of Labour's existence, the party has been a largely liberal or centrist organisation. Now, centrism is a political outlook or position involving acceptance or support of a balance of social equality and a degree of social hierarchy, while opposing political changes that would result in a significant shift of society to the left or to the right. That is a definition that comes from Oliver H. Wyszynski in explaining politics, culture, institutions and political behaviour. So, the existence of a political centre naturally suggests a reliance on the existence of a left and right for its orientation. Supposedly, it selects the best policies from either side, creating a reasoned, logical, balanced middle ground where decisions are made based purely on the probable outcome of the implementation of said policies. However, this also suggests that the framework for such thinking is largely dependent on what we consider to be the Overton window at the time, or in essence, where the accepted middle is to be found at any one point in time. Now, without a utopian vision or an end goal to guide your ideological efforts, any party or movement that seeks to position itself between the dominant poles is going to be vulnerable to shifts in the Overton window, effectively becoming subjectively centrist but objectively free-floating on the political spectrum, like a jellyfish on the tide. Now, when you have powerful media forces from one particular end of the political spectrum capable of manipulating that tide, you can find that the Overton window, and thus the political centre, can find itself drifting into deep waters. A lot of the centrist thought rests on the idea that they are in fact non-ideological, and that ideology itself is a fallacy that distorts policy away from its optimal state. Though most centrists would probably concede that if there is an ideology of the centre, it is liberalism. So what does a liberal utopia look like?
How can anyone be silly enough to think himself better than other people because his clothes are made of finer woolen thread than theirs? Those fine clothes were once worn by a sheep, and they never turned it into anything better than a sheep.
Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, and equality before the law. Liberals espouse various views depending on their understanding of these principles. However, they generally support private property, market economies, individual rights, liberal democracy, secularism, rule of law, economic and political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And that's taken from Wikipedia. Now, constructing a sense of what a liberal utopia would be is made tricky by the lack of hard and fast commitments to specific elements, and by the elephant in the room, the elephant called capitalism. This is because any economic system based on capitalism has to prioritise maintaining that system over any other concern. Any utopian vision that features capitalism has to make capital its primary concern. Liberals espouse various views depending on their understanding of these principles, just needs a small change to perfectly explain the necessity for this statement. Liberals espouse various views depending upon their understanding of these principles within the context of a capitalist economy. Liberalism's utopian vision can't allow itself to become too concrete or too complete a vision. It requires the moral and intellectual flexibility to fit itself around whatever the market requires at any one time, at the expense of actually achieving anything like the principles it needs to champion. Instead, you end up facing the fundamental flaw at the heart of liberalism, which is though it talks often of equality under the law and between different demographics, it doesn't have a concrete commitment on how it will handle economic inequality. It effectively, and poignantly given recent years, outsources the concerns regarding the distribution of wealth to the free market, despite the fact that a capitalist system requires inequality to function effectively. When you consider that most governments we've had in the UK and the US in the last 50 years have had significant liberal presences in their ideologies and policy making, we've already seen this contradiction played out many times. As mentioned in my Lesser Evil video, we've tried this before, and how did that work out? For example, we have seen racial equality enshrined in law, and yet institutional racism is still a thing. Ultimately, liberalism is unable to create a utopian vision for its ideology, or any means to orient itself, as any society that reaches liberalism's stated objectives would need to dispense with capitalism to create the circumstances necessary for such a society to exist. You can't have equality and freedom under capitalism. And it is a contradiction that leaves liberalism and centrism rudderless and afloat.
If you suffer your people to be ill-educated, and their manners to be corrupted from their infancy, what else is to be concluded from this, but that you first make thieves and then punish them?
If you remove the utopia from an ideology, what are you left with? You have a system of policies and ideals that exist in a vacuum, presumably preferred by their advocates as the subjectively best way to manage a certain situation, resource, or issue in the context of itself and only itself. If we take healthcare as an example, we would assume that most utopian visions of a society include access to well-funded healthcare, usually via a free universal system, with no barriers to the society it serves. However, why then do we so rarely see healthcare systems which match these criteria? The societal benefits of a universal healthcare system, ignoring the obvious moral arguments for a second, include a more productive society as a result of a populace that lives longer, happier, healthier lives. So unless your version of utopia has some sort of dumb, Peterson-brained hierarchy or a bitter survival of the fittest approach to its citizens a la Alan Bastard, why would it be part of your ideology? A well-funded, well-equipped universal healthcare service is eminently achievable, with a set of measurable characteristics that mean it actually provably can exist. Even if we accept that a perfect universal health system is unachievable, the very pursuit of such a goal would generate a preferable outcome when compared to not trying at all. However, if you remove a utopian vision of healthcare, you are left merely with a purely methodological framework built around technocratic ideals, policies and targets. This leaves it open to one of the more dangerous and disingenuous phrases used in modern politics, that being a pragmatic approach.
Personal prejudice and financial greed are the two great evils that threaten courts of law, and once they get the upper hand, they immediately hamstring society by destroying all justice.
The Oxford Dictionary's definition of pragmatism via Google comes in two parts. A pragmatic attitude or policy, which interestingly uses the example, ideology had been tempered with pragmatism. And the second part is the philosophical definition, an approach that evaluates theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. Now, both of these are important when considering pragmatism as a sort of ideology in its own right. Centrism, effectively, and as a tool for neutralising the left in the battlefield of the Overton window. The power of pragmatism as a political tool lies in its associations with the words sensible, logical, rational, and by extension, scientific. There is nothing essentially wrong with any of this language or in employing it when talking about policy. But there is a tendency for it to be juxtaposed against left-wing policies, creating an immediate sense of realistic versus unrealistic. It works in much the same way that the UK media and politicians tend to employ the phrase ideological in a negative way, suggesting that being ideological is less realistic than the pragmatic version of the same thing. Populism, likewise, has been used in a similar fashion, particularly when Corbyn was in charge of Labour. The wording, tone and emphasis on pragmatism being a sort of anti-ideology, anti-utopian, anti-populism is a big part of the reason that the UK has an Overton window that exists where it does. where nationalised internet is dubbed broadband communism, and nationalised sausages is offered up as being on a par with nationalised medication. Going back to healthcare, a self-styled political pragmatist might argue that universal healthcare systems are a big economic commitment, and that society would see more benefit from investing some of that economic capital into lowering the high rate of taxes to create jobs. And this for me is the crux of the danger presented by pragmatism, and with centrist politics at a larger level. There is no end goal, no utopia, and no vision for a better future. Simply a continuing battle to maintain influence, power, and control for its own sake. Without a utopian end goal, and the ideological framework working towards it, the material result of policy is vulnerable to decisions made based on motivations outside of the policy itself. All of this leaves a political party or movement vulnerable to lobbying, changing priorities, inertia, and short-termism, allowing exterior forces to shape the agenda, and only viewing each policy in terms of its relation to those forces. Evaluating theories in terms of the success of their practical application leaves all other considerations in its wake.
Kindness and good nature unite men more effectually and with greater strength than any agreements whatsoever, since thereby the engagements of men's hearts become stronger than the bond and obligation of words.
Exploring the foundations of political ideology and the basis for their respective utopian visions is a job for those far more erudite than myself, and would likely be a good basis for a book, or a series of books, given the huge amount of variation and divergence within each of the many political traditions. I have hugely oversimplified and generalised in the political tendencies in an attempt to make some general points and observations, and it would be very easy to pull apart these arguments with a bit of analysis. However, I do believe there is something to be said about the importance of utopia, a word often derided as fantastical, adolescent and naive, in the same way that people talk of ideology being a dirty word in politics. Understanding the difference between striving for perfection and expecting to achieve perfection is something well understood in art and culture, and is often used as an explanation for what drives the very best athletes, musicians and writers. Having a vision for the world that guides your decision making is not a failing, but instead ensures that your thought process do not become too far detached or too far removed from your intent. It sounds sensible on the face of it, to not anchor yourself to a fixed point on the ideological spectrum, allowing you a free choice. But like free will or the free market, you are never truly free from influence, and to pretend otherwise simply concedes ground to those pushing their agendas. When Thomasmore created his city of Utopia, it was to provide a contrast to the contemporary society of his time, but it was also to provide a reflection to the world as it was. He wanted people to look at the unimaginable and ask themselves why they couldn't imagine it. Why couldn't they live this way? And why couldn't they too have the features of this society? I think we can do a lot worse than to create a utopian vision for the world we would like to live in, and then ask ourselves, what do we need to do to get from not a place to our place? Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do drop a like and a subscribe for future content. If you've got any interesting thoughts or criticisms, I would like to hear them. This is only my second video and I'm still learning, so be kind, but I'm still interested in any feedback or any sort of criticism you can give me that will make my future videos better. So thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.